just for everyone's context, I spent majority of my professional career, so without dating myself, like 15 years in the financial industry. So hence why the correlation with the CLA. And on top of that, I had aspirations to go into senior leadership, but to me, I just never got the opportunity. So this is very near and dear to my heart because I think there's a lot of people out there that have the capability, they have the track record, and they have the desire and ambition. They just aren't given opportunities to do so. So I started Divercial. So we have two entities. We have one as a consulting arm, which we do this kind of work and engagements. And then the other part is we do have a product. So it's a B2B SaaS platform. And what we essentially do is it's a one-stop shop for managing DEIB because, despite what people think, technology actually can be less biased than human. So we really wanted to provide an automated way of managing DEIB and provide like a scorecard so you can like quantitatively and qualitatively measure your change year over year as well. But firstly, I wanted to double check to see, have most people like read the report or at least summarize, breeze through it so you kind of have a good idea? Because my intent today is really not to go through the report. I mean, it is available to be read, and I would encourage everyone who hasn't, please do. But at the same time, just kind of have more discussion points, like the nuances of some of the things in the report that you wouldn't have picked up just by reading it, right? So, like what is the objective? Essentially, what we wanted to do is understand the state of DEIB within the CLA organization. Of course, the main caveat is that it is not going to be as granular as it would be for your own organization because this is more of a community association. However, it's still the same process and strategy is, what you want to do is obtain data and insights to help develop a roadmap, okay, with the CLA, what we can do to move the needle within our own community, right? And the underlying context is the future of work. I think when it comes to DEIB, it's a very, I would say, misunderstood topic. I think automatically people just assume and jump to DEIB being, representation of different backgrounds and identities, which is of course an important component, but there's so much more to DEIB than just that piece. And that's where I would say Divercial kind of takes a little bit of a different angle on it too, where we really want to look at it holistically. And, for us, our mission is making sure everyone, so every single person within an organization or an association can have equal and equitable access to the support and resources so they can achieve their full potential. We just want to make sure that there are no systemic barriers and obstacles for people from underrepresented groups. But of course, if you don't fit into an underrepresented group, there shouldn't be, I will say, a penalty for that either. Those people should absolutely be, welcomed and encouraged to kind of go along with the process as well and be an ally. So when you look at the future of work, it's basically this massive transformation we're having in the workplace. And building an inclusive culture is kind of at the core, the foundation. Because once you have that, that doesn't matter age, doesn't matter geography, doesn't matter if you're working remotely, autonomously, asynchronously, everyone's different workplace tendencies, behaviors, and preferences would be accepted. And, the process of this report will kind of hopefully help every one of you as well to bring it back to your respective organizations as committee members and try to understand, okay, how you can use a process like this to leverage for your own organization. And then what we really want to do, Dean, is obviously doing a great job spearheading this, is like building that inclusive community for leadership and talent within the financial industry. So part one was all about collecting demographic data. And I picked this one because, once again, I think people underestimate age demographics and identities. And so and this is one of like 7 questions, and all of them have varying responses. And you can see in the report, it's all detailed and laid out for you. But once again, the purpose here is to see as much representation as possible. Right here, we can see millennials make up the biggest portion within the people who voted in this report, but it's also indicative of the workplace as well. But then there's some areas where, and I'll technically boomers, who are the ones born before 1965, they are significantly underrepresented in this group. but we know in the workplace they are closer to 20-25%. So that is right away, that is like a stark observation. And what you want to do is understand when you have this data, okay, do we have an issue with ageism? Like, are our policies discriminatory towards, people in certain demographics? Okay, and if so, you want to revisit those policies or your hiring strategies, right? So, and then what you also want to do is, if possible, try to conduct a focus group with people that potentially belong in that sector as well, to understand, okay, are there any other obstacles that we're not aware of that we need to address in the workplace to make it more inclusive? So that's the purpose of this. It's not necessarily from Divercial's lens. We are not as fixated on quotas. So, oh no, boomers make up 20% of the workforce. Oh no, we're short. How do we get to that 20%? No, let's look at the root cause and identify that and fix those issues. And then that way, you're going to get there regardless. Once again, like I said, as long as everyone has equitable access, that's the most important thing. And what you always want to look for is like a rainbow of colors. So the more identities represented, the better off your organization will likely be. And then that also comes to the part about diversity and inclusion. Once again, they're not mutually exclusive, meaning that you can have diverse representation, but if it's not an inclusive environment, it kind of defeats the purpose, right? Which we find sometimes. So, the last couple of years, there's been a really heavy push, rightly so, for hiring underrepresented talent, which is awesome. So now you can actually recruit and bring them in your organization. But if your organization isn't inclusive, you're not going to retain that talent. So it kind of defeats the purpose. So that's why you need to look at everything differently. And then intersectional data as well. We could look at, millennials, right? And let's look at how many of them are identify from a gender perspective. And, are there other, racial identities identified? And are those people feeling differently than just the millennial category? We all know this, we're all very unique. So trying to categorize us just as one identity in whatever sector that is never telling the whole story. So looking at it from an intersectional lens is always going to give you more insights. But overall, I would say, this was a good snapshot to kind of capture where, the representation lies. And now, I think I gave you the example of age. We can look at each one of them and understand, okay, how can we make it more inclusive? And then next. So next was about the culture. So there was like three main things I would say that we wanted to kind of like focus on: leadership, organization, and stakeholders. And I think it was Laura, you mentioned that comment right off the bat about the panel leaders. And I think that's a really important point. And this is where like leaders, everything starts at the top. So if you're an inclusive leader and you'd be like, I get lots of these opportunities, I'm the face of the company, I really want to have someone on my team that is like doing amazing work, but just doesn't get those opportunities, let's have them speak on my behalf. Right? Really easy ways to look and fix these things. So just thinking outside the box, I think is, and that's where leadership, demonstrating inclusive leadership is exactly about that. It's like making sure that, you're kind of owning your role as a talent leader and representing your company and trying to be as objective as possible in giving equal and equitable access to the people that you work with. Visibility is also important as well. We were speaking with a client, and of course it's Black History Month, so lots of, great activities going on this month. It shouldn't just be 1 month, it should be ongoing rather than a reactive thing. But also on top of that, if, your company is doing something and none of your senior leaderships are at that particular activity, everyone notices. So it just like comes off as performative. So you need to be like visible and present as well. And, there should be like counsel when it comes to like governance perspective, just like any other, type of industry program. Like if you work in risk management, right, for your financial institution, you're going to be evaluating risk from a financial perspective. But if you look at it from a culture perspective, what are the risks that you have as a leader? Having like a senior leadership team kind of owning an inclusivity council will really, really go a long ways. And I think people underestimate culture so much. I think there's been a lot of talk about this recently, but like toxic work cultures are the worst. And, when it comes, one of my favorite sayings is just, when your employees feel included, being a part of an inclusive culture, they're going to be engaged. And when they're engaged, they're productive. And when they're productive, guess what? It impacts the bottom line. So it's a win-win. Unfortunately, this has been a topic I think that's been, overlooked for so long. So trying to quantify this as a baseline has been very difficult. But Gallup did put out a State of the Workplace report last year, and that number was $7.8 trillion lost due to disengagement and exclusion. So there's a lot of money being left on the table that people don't understand. If you just build inclusive cultures, it's really, really going to impact your bottom line. And then the third part was about program and policies. For the most part, this part was, once again, from a CLA perspective, the CLA does what it does, and this is exactly right up their alley. So for them, they are doing a great job in forming committees like this to make sure that you can move the needle on DEI. But when you look at it from an organizational policy, just like any other program, you need to have a actual policy, written policies and programs around that. So discrimination, harassment, what is the escalation process, right? How do, issues get addressed? The one to me that is most important is from a talent management perspective. And it should be consistent across all organizations. So when you have an objective process, so for example, skill-based hiring. Skill-based hiring is looking at, the skills and competencies that candidates rely on rather than what they've done or education, credentials, or certification. Because one, not everyone would have access to, resources or the ability to be able to, go get an MBA. But at the same time, if you do a skill-based hiring, it's evaluating the skills and what they will be doing for the job. And, and that way, to be honest, I've been a people manager for a long time, and I think everyone can agree with you. We always want the best person for the job, right? So doing skill-based hiring is actually going to be beneficial for all the leaders as well. Workplace wellness, obviously, this is very important and trending. It's a busy time. There's a lot going on in the world, at work, personal lives. So making sure you create that environment where people feel comfortable having access to the support, whether it's mental health, well-being, time off, taking a day off for themselves, ensuring that those are clearly outlined and communicated within your organization is super, super critical. And once again, going back to disengagement, if people aren't feeling okay and they're burnt out, it's going to be evident in the productivity and engagement levels at your organization. And governance, I mentioned that as well, just making sure you have clearly documented policies and programs. It's really interesting because I knew this was going to happen where the pendulum starts swinging both ways. So for example, there's a case in the US already, and I just like to create awareness about these things because we should be cognizant of that. It can happen here too, where it was a white man, and he had sued his employer for discrimination because he was overlooked for a job that he had applied for that was given to someone else. And because the employer could not articulate, the reason why the other person got the job or the other person was more qualified than him, he actually won his lawsuit. This is why this is coming. This is coming. And so I'm telling you, the subjectivity of, that unconscious bias of picking people without actually understanding, is it an equal, equitable, objective process, is really going to start impacting the workplace for sure. Findings. So just a couple of high level, aspects that we wanted to touch on. Accessibility. This is something that should be more proactive. For example, if you have a disability, and I was working on a project with a school, for example, university, and they didn't have an actual statement on their website on how they can make accommodations for people that require accessibilities. And then when I asked them how many people, as students in their programs, identify someone with a disability, it was a very, very low number, because someone who has that, if they don't see that right away, they just assume that, it's going to be a difficult experience for me. So I don't know if that's a school I want to go to. So once again, just being proactive about that. I think within the employer organization, and we already know remote working is obviously a huge advantage for people living with disabilities. So just being cognizant of that. Opportunities for women. This was also a consistent theme in the report as well. Though they are represented as a whole, when it comes to from a leadership perspective, there's still an opportunity to create, those I would say career development opportunities. So for example, if the CLA, wanted to kind of spearhead something like, a leadership development workshop for women who want to advance their careers in, finance, that would be a great initiative to do. And understanding, because there's obviously the representation hasn't trickled up to the top of the house. So let's look at the root cause. What are the barriers? What are the obstacles? Why are women not being able to move into senior leadership positions? So trying to understand that aspect is what's actually going to move the dial, rather than just handpicking, a woman and just moving her there. That doesn't really solve the problem. It's a Band-Aid solution. There was one question also, which, I think the neutral responses are always very insightful in the report, where people felt those individuals from underrepresented groups don't necessarily have the same opportunities for career advancement. So once again, taking a closer look at your hiring practices and policies, making sure you're using like skill-based hiring, for example, or clearly articulating if you're using a scorecard, for example, when you're evaluating candidates. That creates, I would say, a lot more transparency, which can be transformative, rather than people making assumptions or being disengaged without having the full story or information. And lastly, just really quickly on this page, demographic trends. There's lots of different identities. We talked about age, we can talk about gender, but we also, can talk about just in Canada in general, in order to continue growing economically, the country needs a massive influx of people coming from outside. There's a massive labor shortage. So looking at all of those, trends that are happening and how that changes the demographics and the labor force. So companies are well aware of thinking outside the box on how they can continue to bring more, inclusive talent. So for example, when you look at, we have a lot of international students who are paying a lot of money to study here, but unfortunately, they're still dealing with a lot of barriers for getting jobs. I've spoke to a lot of people and also like people who are working on helping solve this problem. And I know it myself when I worked in the industry, that people who worked, let's say, at a financial institution in the Middle East, for example, they were like an investment banker, let's say, in like Jordan. And then they came to Canada and they had to go work as a teller at a bank, just because they didn't have Canadian experience. But we all know when it comes to the financial industry, no offense, but Canada is actually lagging when it comes to innovation. So we should want and encourage people from different backgrounds and geographies to come work in this sector, because they're going to bring that diversity of thought, which is going to be such a huge advantage and beneficiary contributor to your organization. When it comes to recommendations, I mentioned the programming, but like an audit is super important. It's just like anything. You need to understand your current state. If you're going to go buy a house, you're just not going to be like, let me just go look at the first house and just make an offer based on the listing price. No, you're going to do your research. You're going to look at the market, comparables, etc. You need to do the same thing when it comes to your organization and building a culture, an inclusive culture. Okay, what is my current state? Collect some data. What is the data telling you? Okay, let's set some objectives, some goals, set some KPIs. Okay, what is the strategy? How are we going to get there? There needs to be a cohesive plan and framework, because otherwise, if you're just doing random events, or we're doing this unconscious bias course and here and there, nothing is going to change. So there really needs to be a strategic focus on how you're going to be accomplishing this. And then the communication too. I think it's evident that a lot of companies are doing some amazing work and great things, which is wonderful to see. But being able to communicate that to all your stakeholders is just going to be that much more beneficial, including, obviously your employees is a big piece, but even something simple like a monthly newsletter talking about, how you're developing, inclusive culture at your workplace. What are the things happening? What are the things that you want to get feedback on? Anything that's happening behind the scenes, those things will go a long ways. And research shows that when leaders actually will communicate or articulate, strategies on, professional employee development that are tied to their mission, goals, and values, engagement and productivity goes up. So It is a proven theory. And once again, everyone knows this is my passion, but equitable talent management, going back to the same thing. You really just want to make sure everyone has equal and equitable access. At the end of the day, who's the most qualified person should get the job, but make sure the process allows you to evaluate that objectively. Because unless you're using data in your decision-making for talent, it is most likely a subjective decision, which unfortunately, creates the, I would say, homogenous cultures we've already, had to live in. So you're going to create more diverse cultures as a result. So what's next? Three kind of themes that we talk on. Obviously, all the members here are, representative leaders of their organizations, continue to move dial. I think having these roundtables always helps. And we always want to ensure that we continue to discuss, best practices, trends, and issues that are relative to everyone. Program management, I'm going to emphasize this again, make sure you have a deliberate program for DEIB. It's not a couple of ad hoc events and check marks throughout the year, because the only way you're going to actually move the dial from an inclusivity perspective is measuring change. You cannot change or track what you cannot measure. Can't emphasize that enough. And talent management, I will stop there because that I've already talked about, but that was what I had just from like a high level context perspective. And I just want to make sure we have enough time for our general discussion and questions, and maybe I'll pass it over to Dean.